Long ago, before marble palaces graced the earth and the heavens echoed with the thunder of divine wrath, humanity heeded ancient myths, whispered beneath the vast, star-studded dome of the sky. These tales spoke of valor, legends, and the long, winding fate of a man whose power was undeniable, yet whose soul remained lost, imperfect, and profoundly human. This narrative is not about triumphs proclaimed from mountaintops, nor about flawless glory shining like the sun. It is a chronicle of burdens, relentless effort, and unyielding endurance, of that quiet yet profound heroism born from simply and stubbornly continuing the journey, no matter what. Let us begin unhurriedly, with a tradition as ancient as the first temples and the fading twilight. This is a story lost within the countless folds of myth, skillfully embroidered with the silk of ancient superstitions, and, as is often the case, lightly dusted with the indelible imprints of mortal confusion and error. We herald the story of Heracles, or, for those who prefer the Roman style, Hercules. But let us not rush. The story itself unfolds not in the celestial expanses of Olympus, but on earth, in the ancient city of Thebes, though even this name is shrouded in the usual fog of mythological uncertainty. In Thebes lived a mortal woman named Alcmene. She was of noble birth, possessed a patient temperament, and significantly, was married. Her husband, the valiant Amphitryon, was away at war, a circumstance which, in Greek mythology, always served as something akin to wide-open windows during an approaching storm. Something entirely unexpected and inevitable was bound to enter, and indeed Zeus appears, or rather Zeus himself, king of the gods, descends. This mighty, lightning-wielding, beard-flowing Zeus, the eternal pursuer of nymphs, whose marital fidelity could be described as a highly conditional concept. Zeus set his sights on Alcmene, not because she sought divine company, but precisely because she did not. And by the laws of Greek mythology, that was tantamount to a direct invitation. Zeus, having assumed the form of Amphitryon, who had returned early from war, spent the night with Alcmene. He even stretched this night to a full 3, manipulating time itself as only a thunder god could, which seemed excessive even by divine standards. Alcmene, unsuspecting, genuinely believed it was her husband, and thus the seed of a future demigod was sown. The next morning, as the sun rose, the real Amphitryon arrived. Naturally, Alcmene was utterly bewildered. Amphitryon, in turn, was also puzzled when she congratulated him on their romantic evening, which for him had not yet occurred. Eventually, the truth unravelled like a poorly spun thread, and the whole affair, as expected, upset quite a few, but no one as much as Hera. Ah yes, Hera, the majestic queen of Olympus, lawful wife of Zeus, long-suffering, sharp-eyed, and, quite understandably, seething with rage. While she rarely directed her wrath at the true cause of her suffering, her fury only occasionally fell upon Zeus himself. Instead, she unleashed her anger upon the unfortunate women he pursued and the innocent children born of these celestial transgressions. And in this instance, her wrath fell directly upon the unborn Heracles. Now, let us delve for a moment into historical context. The ancient Greeks believed that their gods were not omnipotent in the sense that later religions interpret divinity. The Olympians certainly had strengths, but also deep flaws, pettiness, envy, and a dismal lack of conflict resolution skills. In essence, they were a divine soap opera, and Hera played her role with unparalleled theatrical flair and drama. When Hera learned of Alcmene's pregnancy, she did not merely seethe in silent fury. No, she actively sought to prevent Heracles' birth altogether. She persuaded her daughter Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, to indefinitely delay Alcmene's labour. Poor Alcmene found herself trapped in a tormenting cycle of perpetual contractions, a magical deadlock filled with suffering. Fortunately, her devoted maid Galanthis displayed cunning and tricked Eileithyia by shouting that the child had already been born. This startled the goddess, causing her to relax her spell, and thus Heracles finally came into the world. From the very beginning, it was clear he was no ordinary child. For one, he was enormous. It was said that infant Heracles possessed the strength of many grown men and the appetite of a small army, a rather inconvenient combination for a nursery. Hera, still determined to spoil his existence, devised another, more insidious plan. One day she sent 2 venomous snakes into his cradle. Presumably she hoped for a quiet and unnoticed assassination. But the infant, as the myth goes, grasped a snake in each hand and strangled them. When his nurse returned, she found him perfectly calm, the snakes hanging lifelessly like discarded toys. This story is one of the earliest recorded in the cycle of Heracles myths, and it frequently appears in vase paintings and early classical literature. An amphora, dating to approximately 520 BCE, depicts Heracles clutching the snakes with exaggerated ease, while surrounding onlookers stand in horror. Scholars suggest this story served a dual purpose. It not only entertained the masses, but also vividly demonstrated the hero's divine power right from the cradle. It also set the tone for everything that was to come in his life. Heracles' life, from infancy to his eventual deification, would be a long and complex negotiation between divine favour and divine punishment. He was simultaneously loved and castigated, blessed and cursed, a perfect mythological contradiction foreshadowing his turbulent fate. Heracles was not Alcmene's only child. She bore another son, Iphicles, by her true husband, Amphitryon. Thus, the family had 2 twins, one divine, the other mortal. The Greeks, always fond of metaphors and deeper meanings, used this duality to explore themes of fate, lineage, and the blurred lines between man and God. Iphicles, though brave and noble in his own right, always lived in the formidable shadow of his extraordinary brother. Now let us fast forward to Heracles' childhood. In his youth, he was educated by the finest minds of ancient Greece. Chiron the centaur, a wise and gentle tutor, taught him medicine and music. Linus, a strict music teacher, attempted to instruct him on the lyre, a standard part of noble education at the time. Unfortunately, Heracles had little patience for scales and even less for corrections. When Linus struck him for an error, Heracles retaliated by striking back with the lyre. This incident ended tragically, and Heracles was sent into exile for involuntary manslaughter. Greek legends abound with such unexpected educational failures. Despite these early difficulties, Heracles grew in strength and stature. He hunted fierce lions, engaged in skirmishes with wild centaurs, and performed feats that would put any modern gym workout regime to shame. One particularly early deed involved overcoming a lion that was ravaging the plains of Cithaeron. After this victory, he wore its hide, the very fur that in later tales was often confused with the Nemean lion's skin. Heracles was also known for his insatiable appetite, not just for food, but for experiences. He drank deeply from the cup of life, often to the alarm of those around him. On one occasion, he single-handedly consumed an entire feast before other guests even arrived. Whether true or not, this cemented his image as larger than life in every conceivable way, foreshadowing his legendary accomplishments. Nevertheless, he was not without sin. His temper, especially, was both legendary and dangerously unpredictable, a flaw that haunted him throughout his life like a shadow. The most tragic result of this flaw manifested in the hero's early maturity. Hera, always a patient and cunning strategist, struck again, but this time not with snakes, but with madness. One day, under her terrifying influence, Heracles lost all sense of reality. In his frenzy, he killed his wife, Megara, and their children. The grief, when he regained his senses and realized what he had done, was all-consuming, capable of crushing any mortal. He sought atonement in the only way known to the ancient Greeks: purification through suffering. At the Oracle of Delphi, he sought guidance, wishing to find a path to redemption. The Pythia, speaking for Apollo, commanded him to serve King Eurystheus of Tiryns and perform a series of labors. These tasks were so immense and dangerous that they were considered almost impossible for any human. Only through this unthinkable atonement could Heracles cleanse the stain of his terrible past and perhaps earn immortality. But that is a story for another, even more captivating chapter, which will unfold his journey to legendary glory. Historically speaking, the Greeks did not simply invent Heracles out of thin air. He may have emerged as a heroic figure as early as Mycenaean times. His name appears on Linear B tablets from the Bronze Age, written as Heracles. Over the centuries, his legend expanded and changed, adapting to the needs of each generation. In the 5th century BCE, Athenian playwrights depicted him as a tragic figure, deeply suffering from fate, while the Romans later transformed him into a symbol of imperial strength and valor. He was also worshipped. He was not just spoken of in taverns and epics, but revered in sanctuaries and at festivals. The cult of Heracles had real followers who left offerings in temples, prayed for protection, and even held athletic games in his honor. The Olympic Games themselves, though officially linked to Zeus, sometimes included tributes to Heracles as a mythical founder. Heracles also frequently appears in Etruscan art, often under the name Hercules. His figure served as a bridge between mythologies, adopted and reinterpreted across the ancient Mediterranean. He became a model of the strong man who triumphs through suffering, a theme that resonated deeply throughout the centuries and continues to inspire to this day. Thus, we conclude this narrative where it began, in the cradle with an infant who strangled snakes and never knew true peace. Born of gods and raised among mortals, Heracles began life as a contradiction, wrapped in muscle and prophecy. He was yet to fight monsters, descend into the gloomy underworld, and die in agony on a funeral pyre. But not yet. For now, he sleeps, awaiting his inevitable and great destiny. The quiet madness, or the fall of a great hero. Let us move to a new chapter in our story, where glory gives way to profound sorrow. For before Heracles reached the pinnacle of worldwide renown, he was destined to endure a severe, tragic, and public fall. This chapter begins with madness, divine madness to be precise. It crept in not with the rustle of leaves or the harbingers of a storm, but with the quiet, piercing whisper of a goddess whose heart was poisoned by a long-held grudge. Last time we observed Heracles, he appeared before us as a colossal figure, magnificent both in myth and in his incredible physical might. He possessed unparalleled strength, a legendary appetite, and a beard that, it was rumoured, did most of the work at social gatherings. He married Megara, princess of Thebes, and for the most part settled into the calm rhythm of noble life, perhaps even, dare we suggest, finding happiness. However, such a state of affairs was, of course, utterly unacceptable to Hera, the queen of Olympus, still tormented by the pain of her husband's extramarital affairs that spawned demigods, bided her time. Hera never forgot anything, and, it must be admitted, never forgave. Soon she struck again. This time she did not resort to snakes or complex spells. She used madness, the most insidious of divine tools. One moment Heracles was at peace. The next, his world transformed into an unbearable, constantly shifting nightmare. Hera robbed Heracles of his sanity. Temporarily, yes, but with catastrophic consequences. In his confusion and rage, he mistook his wife and children for enemies. What followed was not a battle. It was a massacre. By the time his sanity returned, the palace was silent. His family was gone. The horror of his deed crushed him. Thus the strongest man in Greece fell not on the battlefield, but in his own home. He fell not by an enemy's spear, but by the whispering curse of a god. The Greeks called this ate, a destructive madness sent by the gods. It was not merely misfortune, but a moment of divine retribution. It seemed even heroes were not immune to such a collapse. Let us pause here, like the ancient Greeks, to consider the implications of this event in myth. This was not merely a tragedy, it was moral retribution, a kind of cosmic balance. The Greeks firmly believed in miasma, the defilement of the soul after such deeds. Heracles, stained by his crime, could not simply continue living. No feast, no prayer, no apology could erase such a stain. He required purification. And purification for a Greek hero was never easy. He journeyed, broken and barefoot, to Delphi, where Apollo's oracle, shrouded in smoke and mystery, sat in the sanctuary. It was she, through divine inspiration, who prescribed his remedy, service. Specifically, Heracles was to serve King Eurystheus of Tiryns for 12 years. Eurystheus, it must be said, was not the kind of person one would want to encounter during a personal crisis. Small in stature, with an inflated ego, and perhaps too fond of resting while others toiled, Eurystheus was Heracles' petty cousin. And thanks to a twist of fate, and a little interference from Hera, it was Eurystheus, not Heracles, who inherited the throne of Mycenae. To be compelled to serve this particular man was a humiliation in itself, but that was the point. The Greek idea of catharsis, of purification, was not about dignity. It was about humility, suffering, and the slow ascent back to honour. Thus were born the 12 labours. But before we enumerate these feats of strength and suffering, let us linger here a little longer, because this chapter, this descent into madness, is foundational. It tells us that Heracles was not merely brute force. He was a man who erred deeply, who suffered the consequences, and who had to earn his place, not by birthright, but through trial. Megara, incidentally, is a figure often lost in the shadow of her husband's legend. In some versions she escaped the massacre, living in exile or retreating to her father's realm. In others, her fate is definitive. Greek mythology, true to its oral tradition roots, is not a single narrative, but a tapestry, frayed, tangled, and rewoven over generations. Heracles' crime appears in Euripides' tragedy, Hercules, a grim and powerful play that explores not only madness, but also its crushing aftermath. In it, Heracles returns from the underworld only to find his family threatened by a tyrant. He saves them, only to be struck by Hera's madness, killing those he had just rescued. When he regains his senses, he contemplates suicide. It is his friend Theseus who persuades him to live, not as a god, but as a man who must endure. This theme of endurance is key. Greek heroes were not saints, nor were they meant to be. Instead, they were a mirror of the human struggle at large. Courage was not the absence of failure. It was the willingness to rise again after a fall. And what of Hera? Of course, it is tempting to cast her as a villain, and in the context of Heracles' life, she certainly seems an antagonist. But here, as with Wrath, there is context. In a world where divine men pursued mortal women with alarming frequency and without consequence, her rage is a kind of divine protest. Misplaced, yes, misguided, certainly, but perhaps also the only weapon available to a queen in a court of thundering egos. The theme of divine madness as a tool of punishment is deeply embedded in Greek thought. Even beyond mythology, historical accounts mention dreams, visions, and sudden fits of madness as forms of divine intervention. In this case, Hera uses the very fabric of Heracles' mind, not merely to destroy his family, but to force him through a lifelong cycle of guilt and atonement. There are visual echoes of this moment in ancient Greek vase painting. A particularly striking red figure crater from the 5th century BCE depicts Heracles in a wild, almost ecstatic frenzy. His face is contorted, weapons swing, surrounded by fallen figures. Scholars debate whether it depicts this episode, but the intensity of the emotion, the divine storm within, is unmistakable. His descent into madness also draws comparisons to other mythical figures. Ajax the Great, for example, another hero who succumbs to madness and slaughters cattle, believing them to be his enemies. When he realizes the truth, he takes his own life. But Heracles, despite all his suffering, chooses the harder path, to live. After consulting at Delphi, Heracles submitted to his fate. The next 12 years of his life would be defined not by his lineage or his ambitions, but by his subservience to a cousin who could not have lifted his own lion skin if he had tried. The irony would not have been lost on the Greeks. It was meant to sting. Heracles was not sent to war or handed a sword. He was given a list. The labours that would follow, killing, delivering, cleaning, capturing, each had its trap, its catch. Some were designed to humiliate, others to kill, and all were designed to break him. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. In fact, there is a faint but curious echo of this structure in modern literature and cinema. The hero who falls, the self-exile, the slow path to redemption. From Arthurian knights to Shakespearean kings, from comic book titans to tragic anti-heroes, this pattern still exists. and it so often begins with a fall not in battle, but from within. Even in early Christian traditions that emerged later, one can find echoes of Heracles' arc, the idea that redemption is earned through suffering, that strength lies not only in might but in submission, in endurance, in service. Later worship of Heracles often emphasized this redemptive arc. In sanctuaries in places like Thebes and Thasos, votive offerings often included miniature clubs and lion skins, symbols not only of strength, but of trials overcome. Pilgrims prayed not for ease, but for the strength to endure hardships, as Heracles did. His myth inspired the Stoics of the Roman period as well. The philosopher Seneca often referred to Heracles not as brute force, but as a moral figure who suffered nobly, endured pain with dignity, and showed that virtue could ultimately triumph even over divine malevolence. Let us now return to the crossroads of fate, where Heracles, enveloped in guilt and burdened by divine command, is about to embark on what might be the most famous to-do list in mythological history. The 12 Labours of Heracles, epic in scope, incredible in detail, and remarkably specific. Each a test, each a punishment, and each woven into the grand tapestry of atonement. Let us begin with the very setup. Heracles was commanded to serve King Eurystheus of Tiryns, not as a court guest or an honoured cousin, but as a servant. And not just any servant. A servant doomed to perform the most impossible, humiliating, and frankly bizarre tasks the king could imagine. These labours, in a sense, were bureaucratic justice with a poetic twist. Atonement through impossible. Assignments. The first labour, the Nemean lion. This lion was not just large, it was invincible. Its golden pelt could not be pierced by arrow, blade, or spear. The locals had resigned themselves to occasionally becoming a snack. Heracles ventured into the lion's cave, armed with nothing but a club and a sharp mind. Realizing the futility of his weapons, he wrestled the beast with his bare hands, eventually strangling it. Then, in a moment of delightful practicality, he used the lion's own claw to skin it. From then on, he wore this hide as armor. It was a choice of attire both symbolic and terrifying. The lion's skin, draped over his shoulders, with the mane forming an improvised hood, became one of his most iconic attributes in classical art and sculpture. Next in the sequence of impossible tasks was the Lernaean Hydra. This monster was a water serpent possessing, according to various accounts, 9 or even more heads. Its truly terrifying feature was that for every head cut off, 2 new ones instantly grew back. The situation was compounded by the fact that the Hydra's lair was in a swamp near Lerna, and its breath carried a deadly poison. Heracles engaged in battle, using his sword for attacks and fire to cauterize the severed necks, while his nephew quickly seared the stumps, preventing them from regenerating. This collaborative effort, it turned out, was no less important a heroic quality. The goddess Hera, observing the events from Olympus, was so annoyed by Heracles' successes that she sent a giant crab to aid the Hydra. However, the hero crushed it with ease. Later, the gods honored both monsters by immortalizing them in constellations, for even minor divine intervention, in their opinion, deserved a commemorative celestial plaque. The third labor, in contrast, was far less outwardly spectacular. It was the Ceryneian hind. This deer with golden antlers was a sacred animal of the goddess Artemis, and was renowned for its speed surpassing the flight of any arrow. Heracles was strictly forbidden from harming it in any way. Consequently, he had to pursue the hind on foot for an entire year. Yes, for 12 months he tirelessly moved through dense forests, traversed mountain ranges, and crossed turbulent rivers. Eventually, with extreme caution, he caught it and explained the situation to Artemis. Remarkably, the goddess allowed him to borrow the hind, with the sole condition that he return it unharmed. This episode serves as a prime example of diplomacy rather than destructive force, reminding us that not every feat must end in bloodshed. It also subtly demonstrated Heracles' exceptional persistence. Rarely does one encounter a monster that requires not so much brute force as cunning and endurance. Then came the Erymanthian boar. This ferocious creature terrorized the surrounding countryside, uprooting trees and effortlessly tossing farmers aside. Heracles managed to capture it by cunningly driving it into deep snowdrifts. This was further proof that a sharp mind is often a worthy companion to physical might. Upon the hero's return with the boar, King Eurystheus was so overcome with fear that he hastily hid in a large jar. This comical moment was often depicted on ancient pottery with considerable humour, for even myth sometimes needs its farce. The motif of Eurystheus hiding in a pithos, a large clay jar, became a recurring joke in Athenian vase paintings. One can only wonder how he managed to rule a kingdom with such a timid disposition. The fifth labour proved to be extremely unpleasant and required considerable ingenuity, cleaning the Augean stables. King Augeas owned an immense herd of immortal cattle, and his stables had not been cleaned for decades. The result, as one can easily imagine, was far from fragrant. Heracles, displaying true inventiveness, diverted the courses of 2 rivers in such a way that they cleaned the stables in a single day. Unfortunately, because he had previously negotiated payment for his work, Eurystheus disqualified this labour. Apparently, divine atonement could not be monetized. Nevertheless, this labour marked a significant shift in the perception of Heracles. He appeared not merely as an embodiment of brute force, but also as a skilled engineer. Centuries later, Roman authors cited this labour as an example of effective problem-solving using natural forces. Sixth on the list of labours were the Stymphalian birds. These creatures were by no means ordinary fowl. Their metallic feathers could be launched like arrows, and their cry was piercing enough to shatter glass. Heracles used a set of bronze castanets, provided to him by none other than Athena herself, to startle the birds and make them take flight. He then shot them down with his arrows. The chosen solution was both theatrical and extremely effective. This scene was subsequently often depicted in mosaics and temple friezes, where Heracles was captured in the act of shooting, surrounded by clouds of unnatural birds. Let us pause briefly in the narrative. By this point in the saga, Heracles had demonstrated not only his unbreakable strength, but also an astonishing adaptability. He solved problems using both brawn and brains, fire and unusual sounds, exhibiting a stubbornness bordering on philosophical fortitude. Each new task added another layer to his myth, be it a golden pelt, a nephew's devotion, or cooperation with river currents. The 7th labour was the Cretan bull. This majestic but ferocious beast had been sent by the god Poseidon, but King Minos refused to sacrifice it. This was an act of bad manners, especially when dealing with powerful sea gods. Heracles wrestled the bull, subdued it, and sent it to Eurystheus, who, in turn, immediately set it free, as was customary with sacred cattle. Some scholars believe that this very bull would later play a role in the myth of the Minotaur. This narrative, like much of Greek mythology, circles back on itself, like a well-baked spanakopita. The eighth labour involved the mares of Diomedes. These were, without exaggeration, man-eating horses. Heracles tamed them by feeding them their own master, Diomedes. The mares, perhaps astonished by such a radical change in diet, suddenly became docile. Setting aside the moral complexity of this act, it must be admitted that it worked. The horses were led away peacefully. In some versions of the myth, the mares were delivered to Mount Olympus as a gift, though one might assume the gods had mixed feelings about the snack options presented. The ninth task initially seemed almost civilized: to retrieve Hippolyta's girdle. Hippolyta was the queen of the Amazons and possessed a magical girdle gifted to her by Ares himself. At first, she willingly agreed to give it up voluntarily. However, Hera, as always, intervened, disguised herself, and spread rumors that Heracles intended to abduct the queen. As a result, a battle erupted. Hippolyta died, and Heracles still took the girdle. What could have concluded as an easy transaction turned into a tragic misunderstanding, one of many on his path. The Amazons, in turn, became a recurring counterpoint in Greek tales. They were feared and admired, these warrior women from a world where strength wore a completely different feminine face. The 10th labour was the cattle of Geryon. Geryon was a three-bodied giant who resided at the westernmost edge of the world. Heracles had to travel beyond the known world, perhaps as far as Iberia, and bring back these cattle. Along the way he erected the Pillars of Hercules, now known as the Strait of Gibraltar, to mark his route. He killed Geryon, stole the cattle, and crossed a vast desert. At one point, annoyed by the unbearable heat, he even shot an arrow at the sun. Surprisingly, the sun god Helios admired his audacity and, as a reward, gave him a golden cup to sail across the sea. It's curious how many sun gods today reward accurate archery with nautical equipment. This is the kind of myth that balances between grandeur and absurdity, perhaps entirely intentionally. The 11th task was to fetch the apples of the Hesperides. These golden apples were guarded by nymphs and a formidable dragon. Heracles had no idea where they were located. He sought help from Prometheus, and then persuaded the Titan Atlas to fetch the apples while Heracles held up the sky for him. When Atlas tried to permanently shirk his burden, Heracles tricked him into taking it back. This was a rare moment when physical strength alone was not enough. The weight of the heavens, it turned out, required a bit of cunning. In artistic depictions, Heracles often literally holds the celestial sphere. No small feat even for someone who once strangled a lion with his bare hands. And finally, the 12th labour, the capture of Cerberus, the three-headed hound of Hades, the sleepless guardian of the underworld. Heracles descended into the realm of the dead, negotiated with Hades himself, and brought Cerberus to the surface without using any weapons. After the demonstration, the formidable creature was returned to the underworld, as agreed. This task, the very crossing of the boundary of death and safe return, elevated Heracles beyond ordinary mortal limits. He was no longer just a hero. He was now a figure who had faced death head-on and emerged from its embrace, roaring, with a companion in tow, thereby completing his atonement. With this last magnificent deed, Heracles' labours came to their logical conclusion: 12 tasks, each monstrous and insurmountable in its own way. Together they formed a mythological resume unparalleled in the ancient world. But more than that, these trials served a specific purpose. By completing them, Heracles was cleansed not only of his crime, but also of his unrestrained rage, his pride, and his deep sorrow. He had achieved the impossible not once, but a dozen times. And throughout this journey he grew not only as a hero, but also as a figure worthy of worship. In ancient Greece, these stories were not merely captivating tales. They served as metaphors for life's difficulties, its disorders, its monstrous challenges, and its many misunderstandings. And Heracles, acting with blood and cunning, showed that even the cursed could find redemption. His labours became a frequent reference in classical rhetoric, especially among Stoic philosophers. They pointed to his struggles as an allegory for mastering one's own passions and overcoming life's adversities. The Roman poet Seneca even argued that Heracles' immortality stemmed not from his divine origin, but from his unyielding moral persistence. Each labour was not just an act, it was a facet of his developing character. And so, through fire and blood, across rivers and heavens, with the help of a lion and unusual music, performing labyrinthine tasks, Heracles appeared to the world transformed, still imperfect, still marked by fate, but no longer fallen. For true strength, after all, lies not only in physical might, but in the unwavering will to continue. Heracles performed 12 labours. He didn't just survive them, he completed them. In this lies an important and fundamental distinction. For while survival is often passive, completion implies conscious intent, a clear goal and a stubborn commitment to seeing things through. And this, in essence, is what Heracles proved. He was not just strong, he was relentless. Now that his atonement was fully complete, he stood before the world no longer as a murderer in need of purification, but as a living legend. His name, once burdened by heavy guilt, now shimmered with mythical resonance. And yet, because this is Greek mythology, peace did not descend upon his life. Instead, atonement was followed by fame. And fame, as it turned out, is a very fickle creature. Heracles' story did not end with his labours. In fact, in many ways, they were just the beginning of his further journey. The Greeks, always fond of good sequels, filled his life after the labours with new deeds, fresh tragedies, and a gradually growing realization that fame could be as heavy a burden as guilt. He returned to Thebes, but did not stay there. Whether due to shame, inner restlessness, or divine prompting, he set out to wander again. Wherever the legendary Heracles set his feet, new tales relentlessly followed him. He engaged in battles, overthrew tyrants, and rescued beautiful maidens with the effortless ease characteristic of a man whose fame had long since begun to outpace himself. In essence, he was the progenitor of the action hero, a kind of ancient equivalent of a wandering blockbuster movie. Among his many, sometimes lesser-known exploits, his participation in the brutal war between the Lapiths and Centaurs stands out. The Centaurs, as often happened with them, overindulged in wine at a wedding feast and caused considerable chaos. Heracles immediately intervened, skillfully wielding his club, and quickly dispersed them. It is important to note that the ancient Greeks often used the image of centaurs to embody unbridled, wild passions. Therefore, it is quite symbolic that Heracles, a personality constantly struggling with his own volatile temper, was chosen as their adversary. Another tradition places him in Troy long before the city fell by the cunning of the wooden horse. The city then suffered from attacks by a terrible sea monster, and Heracles, passing by, as heroes are wont to do, offered his help in exchange for a generous gift, most often the hand of the king's daughter. He overcame the monster but was treacherously deceived by King Laomedon. Of course, Heracles later returned, besieged the city, and brutally avenged the betrayal. Greek myth rarely lacks subtlety in its lessons about honor and retribution. He also joined Jason and the Argonauts for part of their journey, though his stay with them was short-lived. When his young companion Hylas was abducted by nymphs, Heracles abandoned the quest for the Golden Fleece and, in grief, set out to search for his friend, wandering through the forest thickets. This episode is remarkable not so much for its dramatic intensity as for the hero's vulnerability it reveals. The mighty Heracles, broken by the power of attachment. Whether romantic or fraternal, the bond between Heracles and Hylas proved so profound that it could halt even the great quest for the Golden Fleece. These stories, certainly captivating, also served an important cultural function, populating the mythical landscape. Heracles was not tied to one specific place or historical era. He was a pan-Hellenic hero, revered in many cities, worshipped in various guises. His images adorned temples in Boeotia, Argos, and even Sicily. He appeared on coins, in majestic statues, and on countless amphorae. Usually captured in the swing of a blow, with his lion skin flowing and his beard proudly waving in the wind. One story, often overlooked but extremely rich in symbolism, tells of how Heracles challenged the river god Achelous, vying for the hand of Deianira. Achelous, possessing the ability to shapeshift, fought Heracles, assuming various monstrous forms. At one point he transformed into a bull. Heracles, undeterred, broke off one of the beast's horns. This horn subsequently became the cornucopia, a symbol of abundance and fertility. Thus, Heracles not only defeated the shape-shifting river, but also, by chance, gave the world the most festive table decoration in history. In another tale he rescued Prometheus. Yes, the very Titan chained by Zeus to a rock for stealing fire and giving it to humanity. Prometheus suffered daily from an eagle devouring his liver, which miraculously regenerated each night. Heracles, passing by, took careful aim and struck down the eagle with a single arrow. It was a moment of liberation, shrouded in an aura of divine defiance. This single gesture reconciled Heracles with the Titans, made him a savior of human ingenuity, and subtly positioned him not merely as a servant of the gods, but as one willing to challenge them for a righteous cause. However, as his fame grew, so did the complexity of his relationships. Notoriety has a way of breeding envy, misunderstanding, and political intrigue, especially when gods are involved. Recall his time with Queen Omphale in Lydia. Yes, a queen. And yes, Heracles served her. According to myth, he was again punished, this time for killing a guest. A serious breach of Xenia, the sacred law of hospitality. As atonement, he was sold into slavery and acquired by the queen, who made him perform women's household duties. He wore women's clothing, while Omphale, in turn, wore his lion skin. For the Greeks, this story was both amusing and unsettling. It inverted customary expectations. The mighty Heracles, embroidering with silk thread. But perhaps that was its deeper meaning. Greek myth often plays with dualities, man and beast, god and mortal, male and female. Heracles' time with Omphale was not merely a comical interlude. It was a challenge to his own identity. Could a man be strong and yet submit? Could a hero renowned for his violence find value in humility? In some versions, the answer is yes. In others, it is simply another anecdote that provided fodder for Athenian playwrights. Then came his marriages. Heracles was not monogamous by nature or by myth. After Megara, he married several more times. Deianira was the most famous of his later wives. But before we reach the final tragic union, it is worth mentioning one of the most touching stories, the rescue of Alcestis. Alcestis was the wife of King Admetus. When Admetus was destined to die young, she voluntarily offered her life in his stead. Heracles, arriving at the house unaware of the sorrow, was shocked to learn what had happened. In a rare display of pure compassion, he descended into the underworld and wrestled with death itself, Thanatos, until Alcestis was freed. No labours by command, no tasks, just a hero who, for once, chose to do good for its own sake. He is also credited with founding cities, establishing festivals, and laying cultural foundations wherever he went. Some Roman sources claim he established the cult of Zeus in Iberia. Others recount that he dug wells, built roads, and taught people to tame horses. The line between myth and civic propaganda blurs, as it often does. Heracles became both a god of strength and a symbol of order. Ironically, for one whose early life was defined by chaos, even the gods continued to interact with him. Athena remained his frequent helper, and Apollo, with whom he once quarrelled over a sacred tripod, eventually reconciled with him. This quarrel, incidentally, ended with Zeus throwing a lightning bolt between them. Enough divine intervention, gentlemen. Temples were erected in his honour. Festivals were held in his name. Heraclea, a series of games and rituals, were celebrated in many Greek cities, and later the Romans adopted him as Hercules Victor, patron of strength and military conquest. Statues depicted him not merely as a man of action, but as one who carries burdens, leaning on his club, with the weight of the lion skin hanging like a memory from his shoulders. He became an emblem, a symbol of the balance between glory and weariness. He was mortal, yet more than mortal. He could descend into madness, but rise to the heights of heroism. He could serve a queen in humility and still be the terror of monsters. His legend grew not because he was perfect, but because he was not. He contained contradictions. He contained us. And yet Heracles had not yet completed his journey. The great arc of his story still curved towards a final, fateful crescendo. The tragedy of Deianira and the poisoned robe of love turned deadly awaited. And beyond that, the funeral pyre and the path to the stars. Heracles' labours by this point were less a punishment and more a sort of profession. One could almost imagine the hero sighing over his cup of wine each evening, muttering, "What now?" as another utterly impossible assignment arrived on a scroll. Having completed 6 tasks, including wrestling a lion, dwelling in a swamp, and cleaning stables, one might think he had earned a rest. Yet no, King Eurystheus, always eager to find fault, declared that 2 of the completed labours could not be counted. The Hydra, he asserted, was vanquished by teamwork, and Heracles, you see, had accepted payment for the Augean stables. Payment, apparently, nullified all heroism. Thus, thanks to the bureaucratic pettiness firmly rooted in Eurystheus's character, the total number of labours increased from 10 to 12, and these final 6 tasks were by no means ones that could be completed in a single day's journey. No, they were to take Heracles far beyond the borders of Greece, into mythical lands, to the most forgotten corners of the world, and even to the murky gates of death itself. The first of these new assignments was the capture of the Cretan bull, a creature of divine origin and a very ill temper. The bull had once been sent by Poseidon to King Minos of Crete, who was supposed to sacrifice it in honour of the god. But Minos, admiring its beauty and perhaps seeing it as a fine addition to his personal menagerie, kept it for himself. This, as one might guess, did not please Poseidon, who promptly drove the beast mad. It trampled fields, broke down walls, and breathed fire at anyone who dared to look at it the wrong way. Heracles, for his part, subdued this mighty creature without much ceremony. He sent it back to Eurystheus, who, upon glimpsing the furiously snorting bull, dived headfirst into his large bronze jar, a habit he regularly cultivated. The bull was set free, eventually settling near Marathon, where it continued to cause trouble for other heroes. Mythological pest control, it seems, was a constant occupation. The next task led Heracles to Thrace, a land of cold winds and warlike tribes, where a grim character named Diomedes kept a stable of horses. Horses are not usually man-eating creatures, but these were quite special. Trained to devour the flesh of captives and enemies, Diomedes's mares were a terrifying innovation. Some versions say they breathed fire, others that they were simply unnaturally ferocious. In any case, Heracles was ordered to steal them. He set out with several companions and engaged in battle with the king's men. The climax of the story is grim. Heracles, in a moment of dark practicality, fed Diomedes to his own horses. One might assume the moral was something akin to poetic justice, or, more cynically, the efficiency of feeding troublesome monarchs to their own carnivorous livestock. In any event, the horses became significantly calmer afterward. Eurystheus, predictably horrified, wanted nothing to do with them and set them free. Next came a rather delicate diplomatic mission. King Eurystheus's daughter expressed an irresistible desire to possess a unique gift, the girdle of Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons. This girdle was no mere item of clothing or fashion accessory. It served as a potent symbol of its wearer's authority and a testament to divine favour, as, according to tradition, it had been gifted to her by Ares himself. Heracles, approaching this task, initially displayed commendable tact and restraint. Hippolyta, perhaps moved by his sincerity, or perhaps charmed by his impressive physique, willingly agreed to give him the girdle. However, Hera, as was often the case, had entirely different plans. Assuming the guise of an Amazon, she began spreading false rumours among them that Heracles had arrived with the intention of abducting their queen. Tension instantly escalated. Soon the Amazons launched an attack. In this confusion and fierce battle, Hippolyta perished, struck down either by Heracles, who mistook her for one of the attackers, or by her own warriors. Thus ended an episode that could have been a rare example of peaceful conflict resolution. Heracles took the girdle and began his journey home. One could almost hear his quiet murmur, "Can this ever go smoothly?" The next ordeal the hero had to overcome was the cattle of Geryon. This was a task of exceptional difficulty. Geryon was a 3-bodied giant who resided on a distant island, located deep in the west, beyond all lands known to the civilized world. His herd consisted of animals of an extraordinary breed, meticulously tended by a herdsman and guarded by a fierce two-headed dog named Orthrus. Heracles, needing a means of transport across the immense expanse of water, borrowed a golden cup from the sun god Helios. Yes, a cup, and literally so. He used this unusual vessel to cross the great Western Ocean. The Greeks, to their undeniable credit, were never shy about the grandeur and scale of their narratives. Upon arriving in the distant lands, Heracles promptly dispatched Orthrus, then the herdsman, and finally Geryon himself, using arrows poisoned with the Hydra's venom, which of course had become a customary method for him. After this began the long and arduous journey back, during which he had to drive the cattle across entire continents, constantly fending off raids by brigands, thieves, and countering all sorts of divine sabotage. Hera, never abandoning her attempts to complicate Heracles' life, sent gadflies to scatter the herd. Heracles, though irritated, being a conscientious man, regathered all the animals. One can safely assume this labour was not among his favourites. The penultimate trial led Heracles to the wondrous garden of the Hesperides, which was a true paradise at the world's edge. There, golden apples, grown as a wedding gift from Gaia to Hera herself, hung from the branches. These fruits were not for simple sustenance. They symbolized immortality and were vigilantly guarded by the 100-headed serpent Ladon, as well as the nymphs, daughters of the evening star. Heracles did not know the exact location of this mythical place, so he did what any renowned mythical hero would do. He sought out a sea god, subdued him, and demanded directions. Eventually he located the Titan Atlas, who stood at the edge of the world, supporting the celestial vault on his shoulders. Heracles offered to take on this colossal burden, just for a moment, if Atlas would be so kind as to fetch him the apples. Atlas, unsurprisingly, readily agreed and complied with the request. But when he returned, a cunning plan formed in his mind. He offered to deliver the apples himself, leaving Heracles to forever hold up the heavens. Heracles, calmly smiling and nodding, asked if Atlas could take the weight back, for just a moment while he adjusted his cloak. The Titan agreed. Heracles deftly passed the burden back to him, and departed with the golden apples. One should never underestimate a man who has wrestled a hydra, cleaned divine stables, and negotiated with immortal celestial beings. He had undoubtedly learned a thing or two. And so the time came for the final task, the concluding labour. Heracles was commanded to descend into the underworld, not metaphorically, but in the most literal sense, and return from there with Cerberus, the three-headed dog who guarded the gates of Hades. Unlike most of his previous assignments, this required no theft, no killing, no trickery. He had to ask permission. Heracles entered the gloomy land of the dead, passed the shades of fallen heroes, and presented himself before Hades and Persephone with what could only be described as exceptional manners. They agreed to his request, but on one condition. He had to subdue Cerberus without the use of any weapons. And he did. Relying solely on his bare hands and strength honed by 11 impossible tasks, Heracles subdued Cerberus and led him, snarling and snapping, into the world above ground. Eurystheus, by now quite adept at theatrical expressions of terror, reportedly fainted. Heracles returned the hound to its post at the gates of the underworld, unharmed and likely utterly unimpressed with the mortal realm. Finally, the 12 labours were complete. Heracles had faced monsters, gods, queens, and wild beasts. He had travelled beyond all known maps and returned not only alive but purified of his grievous sins. These trials, conceived by a cowardly king and spurred on by a vengeful goddess, had transformed him into something more than just a mortal. His name would echo in temples, adorn amphorae, be sung in poetry, and eventually appear in Saturday morning cartoons. However, this was not the end of Heracles' story. Far from it. The labours had undoubtedly redeemed his soul, but his mortal life would still be marked by struggle, sorrow, and ultimate transformation. For no Greek hero finds true peace, not even the mightiest among them. Heracles, having completed his 12 labours by all laws of justice, should have retired to a well-deserved rest. Perhaps he dreamed of a small olive grove, a modest villa, and a dog that didn't have 3 heads. But no, this was ancient Greece, where peace was always temporary, and rest was for the dead. And even then, not always. The truth was, the labours were never meant to bring Heracles tranquility. They were atonement, punishment, perhaps even a kind of public spectacle. 12 great efforts designed to wash the blood from his hands, yes, but not to ease his onward journey. He was purified of the madness that led to the tragic deaths of Megara and their children. However, he was not freed from the heavy burden of fate, and so he remained strong, restless, and, perhaps deep down, a little lost. With his divine strength and a name known throughout the Mediterranean, Heracles set out to wander. Not in the sense of leisurely strolls on sandy beaches, but as a tireless figure of myth and muscle. He became something between a mercenary and a demigod on permanent retainer. He was hired by kings, worshipped by the desperate, and sometimes feared by those who had good reason to doubt his restraint. He fought in battles not counted among his labours, in wars not sung in epic poems. He overthrew tyrants, hunted monsters, and even, according to legends, founded cities. At least, so the ancient tales claim. Of course, it's difficult to pinpoint where the real Heracles ends and the embellished myth begins. But perhaps that was always its profound meaning. He travelled far beyond mainland Greece into Libya, where, it is said, he overcame Antaeus, a giant who could not be defeated as long as he maintained contact with the earth. Heracles, with practical ingenuity, lifted him into the air and crushed him. A beautiful metaphor, if you will, for how to outwit even the most entrenched opponent. He journeyed to Egypt, where, one story goes, a certain king Busiris tried to sacrifice him, but was himself sacrificed in short order. Heracles, it was known, did not appreciate surprises. He travelled through the northern forests and the shores of the Black Sea, to places where even Greek sailors whispered of cold winds and foreign gods. In many ways, he became the first truly pan-Hellenic hero, a figure whose legend grew with every ship leaving port and every story told over a cup of wine. Local myths absorbed his image like a sponge absorbs water. In Egypt, his image was associated with Hereshaph, a warrior god possessing strength and a regal bearing. In Phoenicia, he was associated with Melkart, and in Italy the Etruscans began to whisper his name in their own rites and rituals. The Romans, of course, fully appropriated him, Latinizing his name to Hercules and crafting his image in the likeness of the empire itself. Strong, noble, enduring, and always just a little too prone to violence. But even heroes sometimes experience loneliness. And so Heracles briefly returned to the matter of marriage. He set his sights on a woman named Deianira, princess of Calydon, known for her beauty, wit, and a certain spirited independence. However, winning her hand was no easy feat. She had another suitor, the river god Hercules, a shape-shifting deity who quite reasonably claimed seniority, divinity, and far fewer episodes of public chaos in his past. But Heracles, never one to lose a contest, directly challenged him. They fought in a contest of strength and form. Hercules transformed into a serpent. Heracles squeezed him in his mighty embrace. Hercules became a raging bull. Heracles broke off one of his horns. This horn eventually transformed into the cornucopia, becoming a symbol of abundance and fertility. It's quite poetic that one of the most enduring icons of harvest and feast originates as a broken horn of a god, defeated in a contest for a bride's hand. Heracles and Deianira married, and for a time peace reigned in their lives. They settled in Calydon, and the hero seemed quite content. But peace, as always, proved fleeting. A dispute arose, as often happens when mortal politics and divine lineage intersect. The couple left Calydon, setting out to start a new life elsewhere. And it was during this journey that tragedy once again began to stalk them. On the bank of a river, swollen and swift, they encountered a centaur named Nessus. Nessus offered to carry Deianira across the river while Heracles swam. This was not unusual. Centaurs, though often unruly, were sometimes used for such tasks. But Nessus had far darker intentions. Midway across the river, he attempted to abduct Deianira. Heracles, on the opposite bank, saw what was happening. Without hesitation, he drew his bow and released an arrow. An arrow, as always, poisoned with the Hydra's venom. The arrow struck true. Nessus collapsed, mortally wounded, but with his dying breath, he transformed his defeat into something far more sinister. He told Deianira, calmly and persuasively, that his blood, now mingled with the pain of rejected love, could be used as a love potion. If she ever feared Heracles might be unfaithful, a cloak soaked in this blood would bind his heart to hers. It was a lie, of course. The blood was now tainted with the deadly poison that had killed so many beasts before him, but she believed him. Years passed. The couple chose another place to live. Heracles again set off on his heroic wanderings, achieving victories, receiving honors, and at times, as in the case of the young princess Iole, showing his admiration too openly. Deianira, hearing whispers of his interest in Iole, felt panic, not from anger, but from deep sorrow and the despair that only love and insecurity can create. She remembered Nessus's words. She prepared a cloak, as he had instructed her, soaked it in his blood, and sent it to her husband. Heracles, always trusting, put on the gift. The moment the fabric touched his skin, the unbearable began. A pain unlike anything he had ever felt, and that was saying a lot, considering he had once held the sky on his shoulders. The poison acted swiftly, penetrating his flesh, burning not like fire but like insidious betrayal. He tore at the fabric, but it would not release him. The more he struggled, the more harm it caused. His skin adhered to it. His invincible strength became meaningless. There is something profoundly human in this moment. the most powerful man in myth, defeated not by a monster or a blade, but by trust, by love, by the unintentional cruelty of one who meant him no harm. Heracles, realizing his end was near, ascended Mount Oeta. He commanded a funeral pyre to be built. No one wanted to light it out of reverence or fear. Finally, a traveller, sometimes named Philoctetes, an archer, agreed. Heracles gave him his bow in gratitude, a sacred weapon destined to play a role in the Trojan War. And then he lay down, surrounded by firewood, and awaited the flames. When the fire consumed his mortal body, something miraculous happened. His divine half, the essence inherited from Zeus, ascended unharmed. He ascended to Olympus, shedding the pain, the memories, and all the burdens of mortality. And there, in what may be the most unexpected reconciliation in mythology, Hera welcomed him. The goddess who had persecuted him from birth, who had tried to kill him with snakes in his cradle, accepted him into the heavens and gave him her daughter Hebe, the goddess of youth, as his wife. It is a neat ending, perhaps even too neat. But myth is not meant to reflect justice, only meaning. Heracles became a god. He was worshipped in sanctuaries throughout Greece and beyond. Athletes prayed to him for strength. Soldiers invoked his name in battle. Ordinary people facing difficulties remembered that even Heracles suffered. He was no longer just a hero. He was a symbol of endurance, redemption, the long and painful journey from error to forgiveness. His image appeared on vases, in temple carvings, in the minds of poets and orators. The Romans erected temples to him, the Byzantines later reinterpreted him, and even today his story resonates in comic books, in muscular heroes on silver screens, in metaphors about impossible feats and the strength to continue. For Heracles did not just fight monsters. He fought himself, his impulses, his rage, his guilt, and in the end he emerged wounded, burned, perhaps even a little wiser, but at peace. Not all heroes are crowned with olive leaves. Some are crowned with flames. Some find paradise not through purity, but through perseverance. And so we leave him not on the pyre, not on Olympus, but somewhere in between, still walking, perhaps, through the twilight lands of memory, still a figure of strength and sorrow, of justice and error, his labours completed. The story of Heracles, one might think, had reached its divine conclusion. He had been granted immortality, accepted onto Olympus, and married Hebe, the goddess of eternal youth. This would have been a perfectly fitting end to a life woven from pain, muscle, and flame. However, Greek myth was never particularly adept at leaving things alone. Even the gods, it seems, know no peace. And though Heracles ascended, tales of his earthly deeds continued to spread, like the aftershocks of a long-forgotten earthquake. You see, the Greeks did not confine their heroes within neat narrative boxes. They allowed them to stretch, to contradict, to reappear. And so Heracles, though now divine, remained. Strangely involved in mortal affairs, his cults grew, his adventures expanded, entire cities claimed his presence, and in many places he was not merely remembered. He was still active, a hero who, despite his deification, never stopped moving. This chapter, then, is not a single story. It is a patchwork quilt of lesser-known tales, drifting between myth and cult, between the whispers of legends and formal ritual. Heracles the Wanderer, the god who could never sit still. Let's begin with a curious matter concerning Heracles and Prometheus. Prometheus, you'll recall, had a rather unfortunate time after stealing fire for humanity. Zeus, in a mood best described, perhaps as perpetually aggrieved, chained him to a rock in the Caucasus Mountains. There an eagle, large, persistent, and presumably quite pleased with its career choice, devoured his liver daily, which regrew each night. It was a divine punishment with a certain grim poetry. And then, one day, Heracles appeared. No particular motive is given. He was simply passing by, as gods and heroes often do in these stories, and found Prometheus still chained, still bleeding, still waiting. Heracles, ever practical, took his bow and simply shot the eagle. One arrow. Then he broke the chains. Zeus, surprisingly, allowed it. Perhaps moved by the heroic gesture, or perhaps simply tired of the whole affair. It's a striking episode. Heracles, the mortal-turned-god, frees the Titan who championed humanity. Two rebels briefly met at the edge of myth, one lifting the burden from the other. It's the kind of story that doesn't roar. It hums quietly, persistently. Soon after, Heracles found himself embroiled in another conflict, this time against a certain King Laomedon of Troy. The king, as often happens in Greek myths, was both proud and dishonest. He had promised Heracles a reward, specifically horses, if the hero would save his daughter Hesione from a sea monster. Heracles, of course, agreed. He slew the creature, rescued the girl, and was then promptly informed that the reward would not, in fact, be forthcoming. This was a mistake. Heracles returned later with an army, sacked the city, and killed Laomedon. In the chaos, he gave Hesione to her chosen archer. She chose Telamon, a companion of Heracles. Together they would become the ancestors of Ajax, one of the great heroes of the Trojan War. Thus, Heracles inadvertently and indirectly helped set the stage for the Trojan conflict, not by prophecy or divine manipulation, but by being cheated out of some horses and quite reasonably deciding he had better things to do than accept. Royal ingratitude. Another story, less dramatic but no less telling, takes place in Lydia. Here Heracles entered an interesting period of servitude. According to legend, he was sold into slavery to Queen Omphale. The reasons for this vary. Some say it was punishment for a murder, not his first nor his last. Others suggest it was a kind of atonement imposed by the gods to teach humility. What's more interesting is what happened during this period. Omphale, unlike most Greek queens, was not content to let a demigod simply smash things. She put him to work, and not in Heracles' usual fashion. He was made to spin, to weave, to perform household chores. In some versions she even dressed in his lion skin and carried his club, while Heracles wore her clothes and jewelry. This, of course, can be seen as a comical inversion, and certainly ancient vase painters delighted in it. But there's more here. A softening. A hero stripped of his tools, his temper, his public image. A glimpse of the man beneath the lion skin, or perhaps, more accurately, a hint that heroism doesn't always have to roar. Sometimes it just folds laundry. It's also a reminder of the Greek fascination with role reversal, with turning the expected order of things on its head, just to see what would happen. Omphale strong and shrewd, ruling the strongest man in myth. Heracles, still formidable, submits not out of weakness, but out of something almost akin to curiosity. And then there were the minor interventions. Stories too small for an epic, but too persistent to fade. He helped the Argonauts in some versions, though he did not complete the journey. He was present in Calydon, though the focus was largely on Meleager and the famous boar. He trained warriors, advised kings, and occasionally settled scores that no one else could settle in Boeotia. He is said to have founded the Olympic Games, though that honour is also attributed to Pelops, and even Zeus himself. Nevertheless, Heracles' presence at Olympia became cemented in the cultural imagination. His statues adorned gymnasiums. Wrestlers poured libations in his name before matches. He was not merely remembered, he was present, invoked in the sweat and struggle of athletic glory. And in the Roman world, he was reinterpreted anew. Hercules, as the Latin tongue called him, was no longer the rough, guilt-haunted wanderer. He became a civic hero, a builder of temples, a protector of roads, a patron of commerce. The quiet Heracles, the legacy of the wandering god. In ancient times, merchants offered prayers to Heracles, seeking safe passage. Warriors marched under banners bearing his likeness. Emperors, in their pursuit of grandeur, donned his iconography, aspiring to partake in his strength. Even the illustrious Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, openly admired this demigod, articulating his meditations on resilience and endurance in terms that clearly echoed the Heraclean ideal. However, this was a different Heracles, polished, politicized, frozen in marble with a faint smile. The rough, impulsive man who once burned on a funeral pyre had transformed into a talisman of virtue. He remained mighty and noble, yet, one might observe, slightly embellished. Nevertheless, his image retained its allure throughout many centuries, cultures, and reinterpretations, never losing its significance. The figure of Heracles endured the test of time not because he was perfect. On the contrary, his undying popularity stems from the fact that he was human. For all his colossal strength, he knew the bitterness of defeat. For all his divinity, he was tormented by doubt. He raged, he loved, he grieved, and he rose again to continue his journey. His labours, however grand, mirrored the more modest accomplishments of daily life, tasks that each of us repeatedly performs, steadfastly endures, and ultimately completes. Today, on the southern coast of Sicily, in Agrigento, stand the ruins of a temple to Heracles. Its columns, now leaning, silently bear witness to millennia spent under the dominion of wind, salt, and sun. Though no one worships here any more, the stones still retain the warmth of summer light. And somewhere beneath these ancient fragments, the story continues to breathe. This story is a quiet tale. It speaks not of great deeds or terrifying monsters, but of a man who once sought peace. And perhaps in retelling his story, we too find a measure of that peace. For Heracles' true legacy, arguably, lies not in his strength, nor in his glory, nor even in his immortality. Perhaps it lies in the fact that he never stopped moving forward, that he passed through sorrow and flame, across continents and centuries, leaving behind an image, a memory, that says, struggle is not defeat, toil is not loss, that even the strongest must kneel and rise again. May the myths continue. May he appear where needed, in temples, in songs, in dreams. May he remain the wandering god, the lost hero, the old friend we sometimes remember when times are hard. His club may be gone, but his footprints remain. By now, the story of Heracles is less a single, coherent narrative and more a collection of echoes, resounding across city-states, whispered in the shade of olive trees, etched on temple walls, painted on pottery, and carried by sea winds from one shore to another. His 12 labours may have been completed, but as with any towering figure, his legend did not cease to grow simply because he died or, in his case, ascended to the company of the gods. The ancient Greeks were not overly concerned with strict narrative neatness. Heroes returned in dreams, in cults, in songs hummed by dying embers. And Heracles returned most often, in temples and rituals, in whispered prayers before athletic contests, in moments of fear and, sometimes, when no one expected it, as a very real presence. This chapter then unfolds his final transformation, not just from man to god, but from living myth to living symbol. For even after his funeral, pyre had turned to ash, Heracles' work was far from over. He had simply changed his category of existence. It begins, oddly enough, on Olympus. When Heracles arrived on Olympus, his mortal flesh consumed by fire, his divine half ascended. One can imagine an awkward silence. Hera, queen of the gods and the perpetual orchestrator of his suffering, was not known for her clemency. After all, she had tried to kill him in his cradle. She had driven him mad. She had placed monsters in his path with the same casual regularity one might set wine on a table. And yet, something shifted. Was it a display of compassion, weariness, or an reluctant respect for a man who, despite all her efforts, had survived everything she threw at him? Hera accepted Heracles not only onto Olympus but into her family. She gave him her daughter Hebe, the goddess of youth, as his wife. And thus the old feud dissolved. Perhaps not into love, but at least into ceremony. The marriage of Heracles and Hebe served a symbolic purpose. He, the champion of mortal endurance. She, the embodiment of immortality. Together they represented a kind of harmony, the triumph of human effort rewarded by divine grace. On Olympus, Heracles remained a strange guest. Most gods indulged in idleness, intrigue, or occasionally interfered in mortal affairs for entertainment. Heracles, however, was a man of action, a creature of movement. Even among the immortals he felt a restlessness. He did not easily adapt to lounging on cloudy thrones or sipping ambrosia while contemplating the nature of eternity. And so, unsurprisingly, he continued to involve himself in the affairs of the world. There are stories of Heracles descending from Olympus to aid in battles. He appears to help heroes, guide kings, judge wrestling matches. His status was complex. Not quite a god, not quite a ghost, not quite a memory, but always present. In some regions of Greece, particularly in places like Thebes and Argos, Heracles was not just worshipped. He was invited. Sanctuaries were erected in his honor. Sacrifices were made. And, more unusually, rituals were performed to summon him, to ask him to come. These were not mere prayers. These were invitations for a god to return, to walk among men again, to protect them in times of trial. One such ritual, known as the Heraclea, was celebrated annually in many city-states. It commemorated his death, his burning, and his rebirth. Unlike most festivals for gods, which emphasized their power and perfection, the Heraclea were about pain and triumph, about the long, scorched road to redemption. His cult grew, and with it, the stories multiplied. Some claimed Heracles now sat among the stars, his lion skin shining in the heavens. Others said he walked the roads in human guise, helping travelers and punishing the wicked. And still others, especially philosophers, began to see him not just as a figure of strength, but as a moral exemplar. The Stoics particularly revered Heracles. For them, he was the embodiment of virtues, the Roman virtues of strength through discipline. Here was a man who suffered, who endured hardship after hardship, and who chose action over complaint, duty over despair. To live like Heracles was not to be invulnerable, but to be resilient. One philosopher, Musonius Rufus, once said that a man should strive for the same strength of character as Heracles, not to lift weights or slay beasts, but to have the courage to do what is necessary, even when the soul falters. Thus Heracles became a bridge not only between man and God, but between body and soul, between myth and philosophy. He became a kind of spiritual exercise, an ideal of suffering made meaningful by perseverance. The Romans, never ones to miss an opportunity to utilize a good god, embraced him wholeheartedly. They transformed Heracles into Hercules Victor, Hercules the Conqueror, patron of soldiers, travelers, and merchants. Temples were erected to him in Rome, most notably the round temple in the Forum Boarium, where people came to pray for success in both business and battle. Roman emperors adored the comparison. Commodus, that erratic and theatrical emperor, considered himself a reincarnation of Hercules. He fought in the arena dressed in lion skins and commissioned statues in his likeness. It was, admittedly, not subtle. Others were more restrained. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, often spoke of endurance, and while he did not claim Heraclean descent, the ideals he espoused, calmness, determination, ethical action, echoed the Heraclean model in quieter tones. And so, over the centuries, Heracles transformed again. He was a hero, then a god, then a symbol, a tale told to children, a prayer whispered by athletes, a statue softened by rain. His strength, of course, remained, always the club, the lion skin, the incredible biceps. But each strength began to mean something different. It was not just violence or victory, it was survival, the patience to carry burdens, the courage to atone, the strange grace of starting over. His image changed with time. The early Heracles was wild-haired, wide-eyed, a man more beast than god. Later, in the Hellenistic era, he was depicted as older, heavier, more thoughtful, still strong, but now weary, a god who had known pain, a hero who had wept. And through it all, his labours were never forgotten. Artists returned to them again and again. The lion, the hydra, the stables, the apples. Each became a metaphor, challenges to be overcome, trials to be endured. Personal monsters in mythical guise. They were painted on cups, carved in stone, retold again and again at dinner parties, temple gatherings, and public games. Not because they were entertaining, though they certainly were, but because they contained something timeless, a structure, a promise that if Heracles could do it, perhaps we could too. Not necessarily slaying monsters, but enduring what life throws at us. Grief, doubt, weariness, shame, and emerging from it all, still walking, still trying, still ourselves. The narratives come to a close, but not abruptly. Some fade gently, like a candle flame flickering at the bottom of a glass, gradually dimming into nothingness. Others echo so persistently that their very fading seems forgotten, and only a rare few truly live on long after the last words have been spoken. The story of Hercules, or Heracles as he was originally called, belongs precisely to this category. His journey, like that of many ancient Greek heroes, began with a profound contradiction. He was a being, part divine, part human, born of the forbidden union of Zeus, lord of Olympus, and a mortal woman. He was hated by the queen of the gods even before he uttered his first word. He was loved by many, but feared by even more. And he was destined to atone for his transgressions through deeds so incredible and arduous that they were forever etched in the memory of generations. We have followed him through all these trials, the snakes in the cradle, the labours that pushed the boundaries of the known world, moments of madness, clashes with river gods and monsters, and finally the grief itself, the poisoned mantle, the flames, the apotheosis, and an uneasy peace. Yet, even after 10 chapters and thousands of words, a pressing question remains. Why does he continue to exist, not only in ancient temples and scholarly texts, not only on the pages of epic poems or in the flickering frames of morning cartoons, but deep within us? Why is Hercules still with us? In our metaphors, our gyms, our dreams, in our quiet inner dialogues. One might suppose it is not about his colossal strength. Might permeates myths. Titans held up the sky. Cyclopes hurled boulders. Achilles was incredibly swift. Odysseus was the embodiment of cunning. And Theseus possessed unparalleled bravery. But Heracles was different. His uniqueness lay not in what he could accomplish, but in what he had to do, and more importantly, in what he endured while performing these duties. The ancient Greeks never sought to portray Heracles as perfect. He was impulsive, unpredictable. He killed when he shouldn't have. He wept when others might have held back tears. He was not ashamed to ask for help. He made mistakes and paid for them for years. And yet, despite all this, he kept going. This, not the lion skin or the club, constitutes the true essence of his legacy: persistence. The Greeks had a specific word for this, karteria, meaning endurance, the ability to bear suffering with dignity. It is the ability to withstand the unbearable, to carry one's guilt on one's back like a sack of stones, and still climb the mountain. It is cleaning the stables when the stench becomes unbearable. It is fighting the hydra, knowing it will grow even more heads. It is taking on tasks no one asked for. It is cleaning up the mess left by others. And doing it not for glory, but because it needs to be done. Heracles became the embodiment of these ideas. He was not a hero of victory, but a hero of effort. The Stoics clearly understood this. For them, he was not merely a mass of muscles. He represented a moral core. Marcus Aurelius, in his Meditations, does not mention Heracles directly, but his spirit is palpable in the emperor's tone. You must build up your life action by action, he writes, and be content if each achieves its purpose as far as possible, and no one can prevent you from doing this. In essence, this is the life Heracles lived, not pure, not easy, not devoid of errors, but persistent. And in this persistence there is something divine, even in death, or apotheosis, depending on one's perspective. Heracles did not find rest. He did not transform into some detached, distant deity, drifting on clouds, sipping ambrosia in bored omnipotence. He remained active, invoked, present. In Thebes, athletes poured oil on altars in his name. Wrestlers rubbed their hands and whispered prayers to him. Soldiers painted a lion's head on their shields, not because they expected invincibility, but because they needed courage. Merchants left offerings before long journeys. Even ordinary people, not kings, not warriors, not philosophers, saw in him one who had known hardship. There is comfort in this. To imagine that such a mighty figure still understood burdens, that even gods once had to suffer through long days and difficult choices, that the divine can arise not only from miracles but from repetition, from resilience. He also changed with time. This too is part of his strength. He became what people needed him to be. For the Greeks, he was an imperfect mortal striving to be better. For the Romans, he was the muscular cousin of the empire, civilized and confident. For Christians of late antiquity, he became a kind of pagan penitent, one who suffered for past sins and emerged transformed. In the Renaissance, he returned as the ideal man, strong in body, brave in spirit, sometimes naked in marble, but always straightforward. In the modern world, he transformed into the archetype of the hero's journey. Trials, growth, triumph, even as the names changed. He was Gilgamesh, Beowulf, Frodo, Luke Skywalker. Every character who starts unprepared, suffers, fails, learns, and somehow, wounded but wise, triumphs. His presence is felt even when not noticed. He is there, in the firefighter breaking through smoke, in the parent working 2 jobs, in the student pulling another all-nighter, hoping for a future that seems out of reach, in the artist who tries again, in the broken heart slowly healing. He is not only among the mighty, but among the struggling, and he has always been there. Because Heracles, as a myth, appeals not to our fantasies, but to our exhaustion. He tells us, yes, it's hard. Yes, you made mistakes. Yes, you're tired, but keep going anyway. Perform the next labor, fight the next beast, clean the next stable, try again. And if you fail, well, even Heracles sometimes failed. The ancient Greeks, for all their drama, quietly understood this. Their temples to him were often built by roads, at crossroads, at city gates, in places where travellers passed, burdened by distance, trade, fear. They prayed not only for strength, but for the will to keep going. They left offerings of oil, balm for sore muscles, and simple food. They asked for patience, courage, rest. And not just in Greece, but along Roman roads, in the forums of Spain and Gaul, on the windswept borders of Britannia. His name travelled not with spectacle, but with quiet reliability. He became a kind of spiritual companion, a god not of thunder, but of a weary nod at the end of the day. It is telling that Hercules never became a god of conquest, not of war, not of kingship, but of effort, of survival, of the tired hero who just kept going. There is something profoundly human in this. Even his apotheosis, his becoming a god, is depicted not as glory, but as liberation. He is not carried to the heavens by chariots and trumpets. He burns, his mortal flesh consumed by pain, revealing divinity not as a crown, but as a quiet core that remained when all else was gone. In the end, he becomes the man he was always meant to be, not perfect, but whole. And so, as this narrative concludes, one might wonder what remains. Not the monsters, they are gone. Not the labours, they were his. An idea remains, the idea that we can face things even when they seem impossible. That strength is measured not by glory, but by effort. That you don't have to be a god to matter, you just have to keep going, and sometimes stop. Lay down your burdens, rest by the fire, eat, drink, sleep. Heracles would understand. He, more than anyone, earned his sleep. And now those who read these words have earned theirs too. So close your eyes, let the world recede. The labours are behind you, the hind has long been tamed. The snakes are silent, the arrows spent. You are not broken, you are not behind, you are simply becoming. As he did, as we all do, and in that long, slow unfolding, you are not alone. The stars remember him, and they remember you too. Good night, heroes. Sleep well.